Sandy.
You are. Good. Okay.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, Sandy reached out to me and we talked about this idea and it just seemed to make a lot of sense. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about my black and white conversion process. So when I first started thinking about this, I started thinking about taking a pad out and looking at an image or two and like making sure I wrote down each slider that I move. I only work in Lightroom, by the way. So that's comment number one. Comment number two is I would prefer, because I think it'll run smoother, the other presenters may feel differently. I would prefer that people hold their questions and answers and comments until I'm done rather than constantly asking, because I think it's harder to get through what we're trying to do. So as I thought about my process, what I really first thought about, and I think it's just as important as what you do in the software to convert the image is, and I really am not intending to steal any thunder at all from someone that's coming up soon, which is Cole Thompson and his program, which is Why Black and White. So this, I'm not even beginning to compare myself to someone as wonderful as Cole Thompson, but I started thinking about my whole idea and sort of theory behind black and white. Why do I convert an image to black and white? When I first came to the Camera Club, I was purely a nature and landscape photographer. I was still shooting all slides. This was in the mid to late 90s. Black and white I knew about black and white, but it really never crossed my palate, so to speak. And a lot of what I've learned is absolutely through the club and through my communication and friendship with all the different members of the club, many of whom are phenomenal black and white photographers in that they really specialize in that. So as I look for images and I'm going to try and get through 3 if I can, I'll see. I started thinking again about why I might convert a color file to black and white. As most of you probably are already aware, you should always shoot in color and do the conversion in black and white after the fact. Your camera's ability to do that conversion is nothing close to what you can do in software. So I realized that with certain images like my some of my candid street photography, if I felt that an image potentially has sort of a timeless quality about it, that would be one influence on me in terms of converting an image to a black and white file. The second one would be images that while I'm shooting them, I'm already thinking that they're going to become black and white. So I have that in mind as I'm actually doing the creation of the images. And the third reason is sometimes to take something that is so apparently and so used in color as something that's shot all the time as a color file, and it remains a color file, and actually look at what converting it to black and white would do. Would it change the emotive quality of the image? Would it make it quite different from anyone else's? So those are sort of the 3 reasons that I usually have when I'm approaching doing converting to black and white. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, everybody, can everybody see my Lightroom screen?
Yes.
Yep, yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
So the first image I'm going to talk about, which some of you may be familiar with, is this image that I call Hamden Girl. This was a one-shot grab as I walked away from this little girl in Hamden many years ago. And this is kind of exactly how the raw file came out. It was highly underexposed. And the first thing that I did with this file, because of how heavily underexposed it was just absolutely boost the exposure so I could get a better look at what's actually going on. And as soon as I saw what was going on in the expression on her face and the dress she was wearing and the scene that was behind her, I immediately thought of converting this image to black and white because of the timeless quality and the thought behind my thought processes, which is that I could probably convert this to a pretty haunting looking black and white. Now, as with any other image, you've just got a whole bunch of things you got to do before you even approach the conversion. As you can clearly see on this image, there's perspective problems. There are lots of other issues that needed to be corrected. I noticed that the fence behind her was running in one direction and the house behind her was running in the opposite direction. The perspective on the fence on the right-hand side was off too. But also right away, I understood and realized that I was going to have to pretty heavily crop this image to create what I wanted it to do. And based on that, some of the perspective control might not have been required. So the first process that I always go through in an image, and I usually tweak it a little bit as I'm going through it, was to basically crop this image and get the right side of that image out completely because it didn't really add anything to it. And this would put her right in the center of the action, so to speak. So that was the next move, was to get out the right-hand side. I then sort of scanned the image and I immediately focused on this stone set of raccoons in the back, which I just adored. And again, it further led me to think that this was going to be a pretty cool black and white image. So in terms of the perspective control, and I know probably in Photoshop, there's a way you can correct the fence line as separate from the perspective of the house. I was mostly concerned in just making sure that that fence line behind her was as straight as I could get it. Go into Lightroom, open up the grids, and very, very slightly adjust it so I feel that fence line is about as straight as I can get it behind her. And you could see it shifted slightly to the right. And the perspective of the house is still off, but I actually in the end thought that that added to the mystery of this particular image, because I've really never known to this day what this little girl is thinking about. The easiest way in Lightroom to do a quick conversion to black and white, of course, is to click the black and white tab. A mistake that some people make is to just go to the saturation and decrease the saturation to 0, which will give you the same effect. However, if you do that, you're going to lose a tremendous amount of control over the color channels, which I'll demonstrate in a second. So that is not the right way to do a conversion to black and white. In Lightroom, the best way to do it is to just click the black and white tab to do the conversion. Now, what's kind of new to Lightroom, and I haven't really played with them very much, is you can also look at many of the profiles that Lightroom has now added into each one of these, and you can just scroll over them and it gives you what their presets look like. And I have been using the non-subscription model for years until maybe about 3 or 4 months ago. So that wasn't something that I had. So I haven't really played with the presets very much at all, but they are available to you. And you can of course pick one of those presets and then continue to adjust as needed. So it's just could be another starting point. So I just wanted to point those out. I'm just going to close those down though and go back to this as a black and white file. Now, the first thing I always do also, or the second or third thing, is while it's still a color file, and I should have done that before, I right click on the image and I make a virtual copy. So now in my library, I've got 2 copies. And the reason why I do that is because after I convert the file to black and white, if I want to continue, let me just close down this panel, which is not necessary. If I wanted to continue to compare as I do the conversion, I have a color file sitting right next to a black and white file which really helps me look for the tonalities and the colors that I want to potentially adjust. So that virtual copy is really helpful to do that. I then just go back to the loop view and bring up the main copy. So in this particular case, I think I also did a little bit of cropping off the very, very top. So let me just do that as well before I forget. Just down to where that watering can is, which I really kind of liked. So the reason why you click on the black and white slider instead of desaturating the image is because you still have access to all of the color channels that exist in the color file. So her dress had a lot of sort of reds and pinks in it. So for instance, by adjusting just the red file, red channel, you can adjust the reds, and you can do that with all of the individual color channels. Another really, I think, better way that I've learned to do it recently is by clicking on the bullseye in the left-hand corner and then bringing that into the image and clicking on an area that you might want to adjust. It's going to adjust based on the mixture of colors. And you can see as I'm moving my cursor back and forth, there's a variety of sliders that potentially could be moving based on the mix of colors. So I find that to be now a much more effective way of adjusting the color channels rather than doing them individually. So I normally would make an adjustment like that first and then still have the ability to work on the color channels individually. So I'll open that up and I'll put it on one of the pinkish tones of her dress. And by moving it up and down, although it's not very subtle, you can get an idea of what you might be able to do with the color channels. And then, as I said, I'll then sometimes go back and individually adjust the color channels individually. What was really important to me in this image as well was her face, which I really wanted to have a certain quality about it. And what I've been using lately is the radial filter, which you can open up. It sits next to the adjustment brush. You draw an ellipse, basically, an oval, and you have to be very careful on the adjustments because it can go side to side or it can go up, down. And then by moving the center pin, you can kind of adjust exactly where you want it to be. Always make sure that if you want to only affect the inside of your radius circle, you have to have invert clicked. If you don't have invert clicked, what you do is going to affect everything else except for what's inside the circle. So I have invert clicked. I'm actually going to make the filter a little bigger. Come on. There we go. And again, you can move the filter right where you wanted it to be. And in this case, I am going to increase a little bit of texture on her face. I'm going to include the clarity a little bit. Dehaze is another new feature that I'm kind of getting used to, but in this particular case, it really helped me give the quality to her face that I wanted it to be. And I usually do these kinds of adjustments before I go back and look at the histogram and see whether there's another more global adjustment I need to make. So I'll stop there with her face, take that off, expand it. Kind of like the look in her face. It still has, she wasn't actually crying, but she had these marks on her face, which you can clearly go back and just do a comparison on. You could quickly see where she had these. I wasn't ever really sure what they were, but I wanted to maintain those. And then in this particular case, looking at the histogram, I've got some certainly some black points set. In fact, they're a little too dark. I'd probably bring the blacks up a little bit. I'd bring the highlights up a little bit. I'd bring the whites up a little bit to just get that histogram stretched out. Now, in this case, I'm not really preparing something for a print. If I was preparing this to make a print, I probably would make sure that I had a solid black point and a white point set. But in this particular case, this is just for demonstration purposes. I don't like that angle right on top of the window. I'm going to take that down. And I'm going to end up somewhere right about here. And again, to go back for the comparison. And whether this one was a color file or a black and white file, I felt that it really had a timeless quality about it, but I feel much stronger about this as a black and white file in terms of giving it a timeless quality. And that's kind of similar to a bunch of us have been to some of the mud sales in Lancaster County and shot the Amish as they were doing their auctions. And I ended up converting a lot of those to black and white as well, because they just lend themselves to that timeless kind of feeling. So that's kind of where I'd end up in this particular case with Hamden Girl. Now I'll just go back to my library. And I'm going to move now. That was the first example, one where when I looked at the file, I thought that black and white would lend it a really timeless, quality. This was a series of macro shots that I was doing recently about a month ago. I took an online macro course and I set up a little studio in my living room, and the black background was being provided by my blank TV screen. And so this is an example of some work that I was doing that I was already thinking these were going to be black and white files. It's not that the colorists that I was working with were so, unattractive. I just felt that the quality of these ultra close-up macros against the jet black or the very dark black really lent themselves to that. So I was already thinking as I was shooting these that they were going to become black and white files. Now, in this particular case, the first thing I did was spot it, because there's a lot of really spots that are not so cool. I increased my feather and I basically went through, and I'm not going to go through each one, but I basically wanted to remove as many of these spots as I possibly could. Again, I was looking for a certain quality in these macro files, sort of a dreamy quality, and anything that's going to really get in the way of that is going to be a distraction. So I sort of went through and just spotted out some of the more really annoying ones. I'm sure that didn't do them all, but not too bad. And again, what I always do, and I forgot to do it again for this demonstration, but I always go back and make a virtual copy. So I have 2 color copies to play with. I saw some other little, like that guy up there sort of bugged me. I really wanted these to be as clean as possible. The cloning and healing tools in Lightroom have gotten absolutely tremendous. And again, I'm not a Photoshop user. I have the ability to get into Photoshop now since I now subscribe to it, but I just really haven't been able to play with it very much. So that kind of cleaned up the file. Then I simply went into black and white and converted it to black and white, went back. I'm always going back and forth to look to see what kind of color tonality. I've got light greens, I've got yellows, I've got oranges. So those are the color channels that are going to make the biggest difference. And again, you can play with the individual color channels, or you can do the color picker, so to speak, which is going to give you that adjustment of color. For this particular one, I'll just use the individual channels. So I boosted my yellows, I boosted my oranges, I was really looking for right in that center portion to give it as dreamy a quality as I could. The greens were going to affect the stem part of the flower, so I played with the greens. I also found that in this particular case, there were aquas that had a slight influence on them. In this particular case, my next move was to boost the highlights a bit. Again, I'm really trying to emphasize that dreamy quality that I'm looking for. This is being impacted by some shadow value. So I pulled up the shadows a little bit. I increased the whites a little bit. I didn't like this dark spot down in the lower right-hand corner. I took out my graduated neutral density filter. Whoops. Let's do that one again. I took out my grad. And I just dragged it over that little corner. Knocked up the exposure. And for the most part, I got rid of the dark tonality. That actually didn't do a good job. I would go back and do that again because I had too many grads in there. I wanted also, these were images where there was a very, very sliver that was sharply in focus, which in this particular case, in this image, it was this edge running right through here. So, bless you. So again, what I did is I took out my radial filter. I kind of made an elliptical shape out of it. Then you can move it and position it as required. Let's just do about like right there for tonight. And again, I boosted the exposure very, very slightly. I wanted to emphasize that edge, took the highlights up a little bit, but I was really interested in boosting like things like the texture and the clarity slightly, just where that edge is. And dehaze is a good filter that I've been using more often because it really has quite an impact on that. And that's about where I wanted that to be. And again, this is where we were. And this is where we are now on the right, again, except for that little botch that I did at the bottom, which I can fix later. The last thing I also did with this one was take my radial filter again and kind of put it in this center portion, spun it, got it right kind of where I wanted it to be, right in there. And then again, boosted things like the exposure very, very slightly. Most of these things always have to be really subtle adjustments. Took the highlights up, just trying to emphasize that really dreamy quality. And that's kind of where I ended up with this one. And again, this is where we started from, and that's where we ended up. So I think it would have made an attractive color file as well, but I think as a black and white, as soon as I fixed that little corner there, it provided me a much more graphic kind of image. So that's again another example of when I like to convert to black and white. The third one was what I said was when you look at something that's so obviously a color file and you just think, well, you know, how many pictures of sunflowers have I seen that came out of the fields in Jarrettsville during a good season? And how do I make my image stand out and look a little different? I really enjoyed this image in terms of a color file, but I also just thought, well, you know, let's just see kind of what it would be as a black and white file. And would it, you know, create a similar emotive feeling? Would it create a different emotive feeling? So I made again, a virtual copy so I can go back and forth, go to black and white. it's very clear what color channels I have to work with in this case. I've got very strong blues, I've got greens, yellows, and oranges. So I first looked at the blue. I usually do the colors first before I do things like contrast and other adjustments, because I find that adjusting the colors within a black and white can have a really big impact, and you don't necessarily need to do some of the other adjustments. So in this case, I brought the blue sky down a little bit. I boosted my yellows. I boosted my oranges. I looked at, now green was going to be tricky. I didn't really want to make the leaves darker. So in this case, I just lightened the greens a little bit. And again, I have some issues here. I took a radial filter and, come on, open up. Thank you. I put it over that shadow area, which kind of bugged me a little bit. So I'll just do it there for the moment, and I just increased the shadow values so the center of that popped a little more. And then I also did another one that basically covered the entire flower. Because I wanted to make, again, I wanted to make that really pop. So again, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time getting it specifically. That's good enough. And I wanted to increase the texture. And I wanted to increase the clarity a little bit. See what the good old dehaze filter does, because I really want those yellows to really pop. I take my highlights a little up, take my whites a little up, and I'll just say that I'll end right there. So this is where the color file started, and that's the black and white file before more subtle work. And you know, in my opinion, and I'm going to open this up now because this is the third image that I've done, is, you know, to me, the black and white file in this case has a completely different emotive feel to it than the color file. And so it's always a good example to take a look at what's intrinsically a color file and see what kind of impact you can get with it as a black and white. Because one of the goals that we're always trying to do, of course, is to get a unique, our own unique images of places and things that are photographed thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times. And so to me, when I looked at the black and white finished version of this and the print of this, it really represented that. It really represented to me accomplishing that goal, which is to take something that is looked at a certain way, de rigueur all the time, and to just sort of convert it to something that looks completely different as a black and white file. So with that, I am going to just do this and stop sharing. And the floor is now open to comments, questions, whatever anybody wants to say.
Hey, Lewis, I might have missed it, but I noticed, because I had to step away for a second, but you had it soft skin when you were lightening up the flower image? As opposed to
soft skin?
Yeah, it didn't say exposure. It said soften. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that, you know, when you go into Lightroom. Yeah.
I would have to go back and look again. I've never, not that I recall, I've never seen anything that says soft skin.
Maybe it was a happy mistake.
Maybe.
Lewis, I have a question.
Absolutely, go ask away.
Yeah, when I was used Lightroom, I was pretty addicted to the curves, I guess, and I noticed that you didn't use them and you did quite well without them. So what is it exactly that's going on? Is that because of the black and white sliders you were using?
No, it's really, Lightroom has 16 different ways to accomplish the same goal. So what I've learned over the last year, though, you can make more subtle adjustments with the tone curve than you can with the sliders. And the reason you can is because you can, if you, well, I'll just do this actually, it's just easier. The reason that's true is because if you want to make more subtle adjustments by opening up the tone curve right here, by clicking right there and taking the control out of Lightroom, basically, you now can move the control points to where you want them to be. So you can make far more subtle adjustments using the tone curve than you, wow, that's interesting. I don't know what happened there.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one. I really don't, that's bizarre. Let's just do reset and see what happens. So for a quick demonstration purpose, it was easier for me to just demonstrate just some of the sliders that I use to do some of the black and white conversions. I think the color channel sliders, to me, actually doing in a black and white conversion are usually my most important adjustments. And I find some of the other adjustments that I make overall, the overall global adjustments like contrast and clarity, I find that I don't need those as much once I've sort of adjusted the color channels to where I want them to be. But it's really, I used to say it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. It's really not. You can do far more subtle tonality changes using the tone curve and setting those black, mid-tone, and white points exactly where you want them to be. So I just didn't happen to do that tonight.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. So what did people think about how the images looked converted to black and white from color? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I agree on the sunflowers. I try to do things that make things look unique myself, at least try it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I was
Lewis,
I was happy with the way that turned out. Yep.
this is Walter. Hi. I was particularly intrigued with the first image of the young girl.
Mm-hmm.
And that expression on her face is just, lovely. And I think that the black and white conversion worked very well. I was wondering if the background had been simple, would you have wanted to maybe keep it in color? Because the color of her dress, the color of her skin tone was nice. It's just that it was fighting with the rest of the picture in my mind.
Yeah, I'll answer that pretty succinctly. No, and the reason was the dress. The dress could have come out of 1930s or 1940s Appalachia to me, the flowered dress. So
Yeah.
when I saw that in combination with the haunting quality of the face, I really, and this was years and years ago before I really did a lot of black and white conversions, or certainly did fewer. I immediately thought that image would just be striking in black and white. And I actually thought the background would be less, although there's parts of the background that I think really add to that image, especially the stone raccoons and the water.
Yeah.
I just immediately thought that as a black and white file, it would be more impressive. So, so that was my thought pattern on that.
Thank you.
Lewis, this is Kaye Ibrahim.
Yes, Kaye.
I loved the conversion with the little girl and with the sunflower, but the other image I preferred in color.
Okay, the macro
because
image.
the colors were beautiful,
Mhm.
and it just said more to me as a color image.
As I said when I introduced it, the colors were not unattractive. It was more that as I started shooting these calla lilies against the black background, I a little kind of a little project popped into my head as to where I could go with these shots, and I've now worked on about 3 different varieties of them. Ones where things like focus stacking kept everything sharp, you know, in focus. Then I worked on a bunch like the one that I used tonight, which is just a tiny sliver in focus. And then I actually worked on a bunch where they're kind of almost like nebulous in quality, and they're all black and white files. And so I was already sort of thinking that, I think, when I started shooting them. So you're right, though. I mean, I have some purple calla lilies popping up in my yard, and I think those I would probably want to shoot first in color and just see how that purple against the black is going to look, because it'll look really striking.
Be striking.
Yep. But thank you. All right. Well, if nobody else wants to comment or ask a question, I think what I'll do now is turn it over to Miss Kaye Flamm, who's going to take over from here.
Okay, well, thanks, Lewis. So I think you gave everybody a lot to think about with black and white. So I'm going to switch horses and talk about color images. And I do both and love both. And so hearing you talk kind of made me think about, well, when do I convert to black and white? And it's like, when I first started doing photography, it's like if the color didn't work, then I'd go black and white.
Right.
But, you know, as time goes on, it's like you say, certain things really speak to you more by their values and their shapes and what they can communicate without the color. And then other images are really kind of all about color. And the one I am going to show you tonight is all about color. And this is an image, some of you might have seen it. I had it in the last print competition when we were able to meet at the church. And this is also something I picked to show tonight because it is something I processed recently. I actually made the image about 3 years ago, but I processed it this year for the print competition. So I thought it was a good representative kind of my current thinking about how I go about doing color, because I think all of us, as we mature as photographers and read stuff and find ideas we want to try, you know, we're always evolving our methodology. So this is sort of my current thinking about color. This is Blue Poppy. It was made at Longwood Gardens in March about 3 years ago, and they've typically had blue poppies on display at Longwood Gardens every spring, and I think I've seen them a couple of times. So like I said, this was made 3 years ago. And what I have on the screen now, can everyone see 3 images?
Yes.
Yeah. So on the left is the original raw file, and we'll look a little more closely at that in a minute. And I'm going to take that raw file and show you what I do in Lightroom, which would take it to the point of what you see in the middle. And then almost always I take my Lightroom processed images into PeopleSoft, I think I'm still working, Photoshop, and finish it up, and I print out of Photoshop. So I'll also show you what I did with this one in Photoshop. So you can see the progression, and the original image is pretty dull, and thinking it, I'm surprised here. I thought maybe I changed one of my settings, but just as a point of reference, this was made on a tripod. It was 1/17 of a second, and the ISO was 3200, and it was a f-stop of 22. So it was set up to get a lot of depth of field, and it was indoors, it was only natural light, and so with even with 3200 ISO, you can see it's a bit underexposed, but it's not too bad. And what I did with this, and I'll take you kind of to that middle point, is I looked at it, and when I process images in Lightroom, and I always start in Lightroom, I don't start in Photoshop, I first look and look at the composition and the cropping. And this one was done on a tripod, and this is one of my few images that I have not cropped at all. And I almost always do a little bit of cropping or straightening or something like that. And I think those of you who've seen my work know that I tend to have a lot of things that are really more architecture and man-made or hand of man. And usually that type of image needs some straightening or some cropping, but this being something more natural, didn't really need it. So the first thing I would do here is I would say, well, before I even start, I'm just going to get rid of the spots. And there aren't very many. This one's actually pretty good for a macro shot. Often macro shots will be really full of a lot of junk, but this wasn't too bad. So I do that. Then the next thing I would do with anything I'm processing is I would just say, okay, well, I want to see if I let Lightroom control the adjustment, what would it look like? And so I hit the auto button just to see what Lightroom does. And I think, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I turn it off because I usually do my own thing. And then weirdly, it doesn't turn vibrance off after it's adjusted. So I turn that off. So the first thing I do with this is I'm saying, well, the histogram is obviously too far to the left. It's too dark. So I'm going to get the exposure up to where it needs to be. And I took this one to about 1. And now you can see the histogram looks like it's about in the right place. I mean, the image still needs a lot of work, but it's a better starting point. And then my next step on something like this is I'll usually go ahead and change the tone curve to medium contrast. And actually now when I bring images into Lightroom, I have some things set up and I'll usually just apply that to every image I bring in because it does help them and makes them look a little bit better. In this image, I mean, I've already made the decision, it's about the color. So I'm starting to look at it and think, well, what do I have going on here with the color? And do I like what I see? And the camera that I shoot with most of the time is a Fujifilm camera. And they have, they provide in the camera and also as plugins for software, simulations of their different film types. And that was one of the reasons I got the camera. I was never a film photographer. I don't know much about film really. I mean, I shot a little bit a long time ago, but not with a lot of knowledge or intent. And when I read about Fujifilm cameras and the fact that they had these simulations, it sounded really interesting to me. I don't really use them all that often processing, but I did use them in this case. So when you go to set up the profiles, they've been automatically pulled in. And in the case of this image, you can see where I'm scrolling through, and these are all the camera profiles that are available. I actually think this ASCII soft is often very nice for nature. It does a good job with the greens. But in this case, since this is about the blue and the orange, I did switch this to the Velvia Vivid. And you can see that that's made quite a bit of difference. Oh, and one thing I wanted to say is this presentation, I think, is going to be sort of concise. So if you have any questions and want to speak up and ask them as I'm going along, feel free. So I changed it to the Velvia Vivid. So we'll close that out. And I've changed the tone curve, and I think you can see it's already starting to look a little better. And if you can see it like that, maybe I'll leave it like that. You can kind of see what I'm doing. So then what I would typically do is I would go in and make some universal adjustments. And I don't have a lot of defense of what I'm going to do, but it's just what I always do. So I thought I would just show it to you this way. Is I look at something like this that looks a little bright, and I always just pull the highlights down. And then it might seem kind of weird or kind of counterintuitive, but then I go and I pull the whites in one direction and the blacks in another and kind of get a range of values from this point. So in this case, I'll just kind of take the whites up to about 40. And what I'm usually looking for here is I have this turned on where it shows you where you're starting to get some blown out highlights. And I just saw those little red specks pop up right there. You know, you can see if I went to 50 there that it would, yeah. So if you can see those, so I know that if I stop at 40, I haven't blown anything out, but I've taken it kind of right to that point. And then with the blacks, same kind of thing. I type in 20 and, you know, maybe go a little bit more, but you can see it's starting to darken up here. So I'm thinking, well, I've got the full range of values and I'm satisfied enough with the way that looks. When I do other images, I almost always make use of shadows too, but I didn't feel like it really added anything on this image, so there really was no shadow adjustment. And then I just kind of touch clarity a little bit on this. I'm doing things more architectural. I use clarity a lot, but I think with nature, you have to be really careful or you start looking kind of weird. So those are the global adjustments. And so then at that point, it's like, okay, well, the image kind of is as it was and doesn't look too bad. Start thinking about, from a point of view of it being something that's a little more artistic, something that's conveys a little bit of balance and harmony and, you know, a little bit more about the kind of beauty of nature. What would you do with this to make it more pleasing than what's in front of us? And I usually do that with local adjustments, and the kind of things I'm thinking about when I consider that as well, you know, what could add balance to this? Having complementary colors, certainly, I mean, the balance is kind of already there. And then the other things you can consider is, do you have cool tones or warm tones? Do you have lights and darks? Do you have some areas that are saturated and some that are unsaturated? All kind of with that idea of having an image that looks like it has nice balance to it, because that's what's going to be pleasing when somebody looks at it, is if you obtain, you know, some balance or harmony in your image. So, I mean, this is natural. I mean, nature does a good job of presenting things that are beautiful and harmonious, but, you know, let's try and just highlight some of that. So again, using the local adjustments, and that's using the brush tool, I would go in and try to achieve certain things. And I've already set this up with 4 brushes that were what I used before, but they've been, you know, set back to 0. So when I click through, you can see the areas I'm going to adjust. And I thought that would make it a little bit quicker. And the first area that I would adjust when I look at this is the background, which is the green, because the green is not really doing anything for the image. It kind of competes with the image a little bit. And so I come into that, and I think I might have, you know, first pull down the exposure, and oh, it went to 4. Should be minus 0.4. So that was a little better. Then I'd get rid of about half of the saturation, because again, the green doesn't serve a lot of purpose in the picture, and from my point of view was competing. The bokeh is pretty good in the background. There isn't anything that's really competing, but just to make sure, I'd pull the clarity down some, and that's what I would do with that. The other thing that really kind of pops out at me when I look at this, or, you know, some of you kind of just like squint at something or get back from it, you notice that this, I think that's called a stigma on a flower. It's too bright. I mean, it almost stands out more than anything else. So that needs to be brought down in exposure. Minus 0.4. Yeah, so that looks better. And then I look at the petals and the stamen, and again with this idea of adding a bit more of a design element that's things that contrast, that produce balance. I decided to make the outer part of the image more cool and experiment with that, and then make this orange part just a little bit warmer, although there's a lot of warmth here now. So that was what was brushed in, was this outer part. So selecting that, the way I make it more cool is I just pull the temperature down. And so it, you know, it pulls it towards the blue. It really even kind of saturates the blue a little bit more. And I think produced a pretty nice effect there. I was just looking to see when I did it before. Yeah, I had it at -20, so -28 is about right. And then I experimented with making this part warmer, and it actually didn't need too much. I mean, anything you know, made it kind of like too much. So I just think I just had a little touch of warmth there on that, and thought it starting to look good. And you can kind of see if I turn, this is turning all the brushes off and all the brushes on. You can see the impact there. And just looking to see if there was anything else that's worth noting. Oh, I did, after the brushes. This one I probably could have done nothing more, but I did just bring the saturation down a little bit and the vibrance up a little bit more, just kind of change the character of it a little bit. But this is all kind of fine tuning. It's what I did the day I did it. You'll do it again today, and you might not really do those things. You might do something completely different. So is everybody with me so far?
Yep.
All right. So we'll go from there. We'll see how close we came. Okay, so that's the one I just processed. And this is the one that's a depiction of what I used when I made the print. So they're pretty close. And now I'm going to switch my screen over to Photoshop. So you see one single image now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the same image we just looked at. And I have turned off the adjustments I made. And I use Photoshop probably the most if I like want to clone something out or add something in or change things around or get a lot of messy stuff out. So I do a lot of that, but this image didn't need it. And I was really talking about color, so I kind of picked it for that reason. But what I just showed you in Lightroom and what I'm going to show you here is pretty much what I do with my images that I'm doing in color, no matter what the topic is. So a flower versus a stucco building that's got a bunch of different colors and interesting architecture. Probably what I would do would be pretty similar. So I would look at this image, and it is a little bit noisy because again the ISO was 32. So the first thing I did is I made a copy of the images that came in, which would be this layer here, and I apologize that this font is so small. I think it's because of the resolution of my monitor. But anyway, it says define too. So I used the Nick filter to remove the noise. And I don't know if you can see, but it does a pretty good job. It took it from being really kind of noisy in here and kind of flattened all that out. You do lose a little sharpness when you do that, but for this image and the way it printed out, it was really not significant. And then the next thing I do, and I usually do it at this stage or I do it at the end. It kind of really doesn't matter, but I'll make a copy of the image again, and then I'll sharpen a copy. So this, and when I sharpen, I use the unsharp mask filter. That's right here. And what I've learned using different cameras is that seems to me like kind of each camera kind of has like a sweet spot for sharpening that I can use like almost all the time, and it looks pretty good. So again, I do almost the same sharpening formula on every image. The only thing I might do a little different sometime is if I felt like the whole image couldn't take the sharpening, I might mask it out. So I do that. And then I do what I call the kind of the finishing on the image. And I always darken the edges again, even if I've kind of done some things before. And you know, when I pulled down the tint or made the edges cooler, it actually darkened it up quite a bit. But I darken things again, and the way I do that is, and actually my adjustments are right there under group 1, but I'll show this. I darken the edges is I take the selection tool and pull a rectangle, and then I feather the corners so that it's not totally square. And I actually don't like that one. Try it again. So it's like that, and then that would be selecting inside. So since I want to darken the edges, I do the inverse, and now it's selected the outside. And so whatever layer I choose to apply will just be within that frame. And at this point, you could use exposure and just darken it through exposure. What I do a lot of times though is I use a solid color. And you can see how that's made it really dark. And oops. Then you would go over to the opacity and pull it down to some amount that's more reasonable. And then hit the mask and kind of filter the edges.
Kay, this is Mike.
Yes.
Do you prefer doing the vignetting that way rather than the vignette tool in Lightroom?
Yeah, because I think this is well, you get a little more control. Well, I like being able to control the shape and the amount of feathering, and you can't do either one of those things in Lightroom. And I use Lightroom's vignette, but for finishing a print, I like to do it this way because again, I can control what size it is. I can control how much feathering I put on it on the corners, and then I can hit this mask and I can control how much I feather the whole thing. So I feel like I have more control. And what I'm actually going to show you that I did on this image is I didn't use a black edge, but I went with blue because again, this image was about color and it was about the contrast between the orange and the blue. So I said, well, I wonder how it would look if I made this blue instead of black. And I liked the way that turned out. So so you can also do things like that. And so it's I think it's ultimately more powerful than what you can do in Lightroom.
Yep, I really liked it. It's I've not done it that way, and I will the next time. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. So actually, this is something I've been doing with my prints for a number of years, and I read it and I just always followed it. And so again, you just select the rectangle on the edge and then you invert it, and then you can. And if you wanted to, once you have that selected, you could even just use a curve. And you can, just pull down the darks or pull down the midtones. It kind of gives you a lot more flexibility than you get with the vignette tool. And so with this, I'm almost done. The only other thing I did was, felt like it was still a little bit flat. And I went in and just tweaked the curve a little bit. Try again. again. Something like that, I guess. You can see it just kind of gives it a little bit more life in the middle and doesn't really affect the edges too much. So I am satisfied with that, and those are the two adjustments I just made. Group those, turn them off, and these are the ones in the print. Pretty close, I guess. So are there any questions about the Lightroom or the Photoshop or the process in general?
Yeah, okay, this is Kenny.
Yes.
I was wondering, the top of the flower, where it's a lot lighter there, would you leave that there in your process versus cloning it out?
Yes, I left it there. I actually liked it. I thought it added a little bit of interest and some contrast. So do you find it distracting?
A little,
Yeah.
because the petals are really smooth, and then you have that one folded leaf there.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
This is Tom Gisrael. I find it distracting too.
Yeah, this is Diane. I do as well.
Are you talking about the blue left corner?
yes,
Okay.
up top.
Right. I see what you're talking about.
Hey, have you ever tried using the high pass filter for a high pass layer for sharpening? It gives you a mask so you can actually pinpoint what you want to sharpen. And I personally think it's the best way to sharpen stuff is using the high pass filter. Have you ever tried that?
I have, but I'm not proficient at it. But since you mentioned it, maybe I would go back.
Because it also creates, since it creates another layer, you can make a mask on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the opacity works, the mask works, flow works, all that stuff works. So, and it can really do a great sharpening job. Basically, it's taking it back to a lab format, and it's just changing the luminosity. And you rarely get any halos if you over sharpen a high pass.
Mm-hmm.
You can, but you rarely get that. The sharpening tool in Lightroom is also excellent. So if you ever use that one too, but the high pass filter is really good.
Yeah, so I have to talk to you offline about Lightroom sharpening, because I have to admit I don't understand it all that well. And when are you sharpening the work in progress versus the output? You know, that's always been a little bit confusing to me in Lightroom. Okay, well, so can you all see now I've got Lightroom up, original.
Yes.
Okay. So I cropped that off. So I think there are folks out there, you like that one better?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do too.
I do too.
Yes.
Yes, me too.
You could also have cloned into that upper left-hand corner to keep the same ratios and stuff.
Yeah.
Hey, Kaye, this is Lewis. Thank you very much. I have a question about, do you know in Lightroom, do you necessarily need to be shooting a Fuji camera to get those Fuji film simulations to come up? Because they don't come up, you know, when for my Olympus or Nikon files. And I'm just curious whether they only come up if the images are coming from a Fuji camera.
Yes, I think that's the way Lightroom is designed, is it recognizes the raw file and its source, and they work with the manufacturers to load in the profiles.
Okay.
And I have two Fuji cameras, and the XT1 had a subset of profiles that is fewer profiles than XT2. And when it sees XT2, it knows, okay, I give these profiles. And when it's XT1 files, it gives me fewer.
Right.
So I believe it's a collaboration between Lightroom and the.
Hey, Lewis,
yeah.
Lewis, you might be able to go online to the Adobe, and sometimes they have those profiles that you have to download. It's not automatic.
Yeah, because I used to shoot a hell of a lot of Fuji Velvia, and I just would be interested to see what that would do to some of my color files. All right, Steve, I will look into that. And thanks a lot, Kay. Excellent presentation.
Yeah, it's really good.
Hey, Kay, I have a question. This is Scott.
Yes.
What's the best way to think it's related? When you're taking a Fujifilm camera photo and then converting it to Astia or Velvia as a post process, is the time to do that as soon as before you start making all the major manipulations of the photo?
Oh, yeah, I would say so. I mean, if it occurs to you it's something you might want to do pretty far down the road, then my guess is you're going to have to undo some of your manipulations, because it makes quite a difference. But it's still worth trying at any point. But you have to do it before you take it into into Photoshop and bring it back. Because when it comes back from Photoshop, all that's dead when you bring the TIFF file back.
Yeah, so the profile is really a sophisticated proprietary filter. Is that the best way to look at it?
Yes, and you know, when Lightroom reads the original raw file. But you can't do it. And, you know, I've actually wanted to do it after I've had something in Photoshop and saved it in Photoshop, and you absolutely can't. So it's like, darn, you know, if I want to do it, I have to go all the way back to the beginning. So, you know, it just depends on how bad you want to do it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, this is Kenny again.
Yes.
I just want to make a comment. I really like your thought process, and when you're first looking at the image, right from the very beginning, you're already thinking about, what do I want to do with this image? What needs to be fixed? How can I make it better? Where does it need to be cropped at? And I think that's important, because a lot of times people, you know, when they're working on images, you know, they're not really thinking about what is it that image really needs. And it's nice to hear you talk about, well, this is what I'm thinking. This is how the colors may need to be changed. I may want to do some artistic work on it. So you already have a game plan right up front. And I think that's important, because when when you know, I'm just saying this mostly for the beginners, you have to really think about, you know, when you're looking at your image, first of all, what corrections I need to make this image better, and then start developing a game plan. What do I want to do with this image? And I saw that throughout your whole process, and I think that was really good and that's something I wanted to note for the other people.
Right. Well, thanks for your comment. And one thing I hope to convey along that line is, if you just learn, you know, probably the number of things I did, you know, maybe like 8, 10 things. And if you get good at 8 or 10 things, then those are kind of like the tools you can apply to any type of image to change the values, change the saturation, make certain things stand out. And then if you're working in black and white like Lewis was, I mean, you could see he had his tools that he uses for black and white, and many of the tools I use could be used for black and white, but you just don't have the color piece. Thank you, Kenny.
You're welcome.
Okay. How about Harry?
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Good. Great. You're on.
Let me get the screen. Where do I'm down at it. Did you make me the host? Because I went to share screen. Oh. Okay, hold on. Bear with me. All right, so this is where I'm going to end up. Can everybody see that? Everyone see my screen?
Not
I
yet.
can't.
No.
All right, hold on. I went to, let's see.
Share screen down the bottom.
Yeah, and let's see if I get it now. How about now?
No.
No.
You know, I taught a class this summer using Zoom, and let's see. So you need to, I haven't been made the host.
Well, you are a co-host.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you should be able to. Jim, what was it that you said earlier? What stopped you from being able to share a screen? You said you can't when you are. Remember, Jim Vogelin, are you there? Maybe not.
He's muted. Let me see. You're a co-host.
Harry, you are co-host.
Right. So why can't you see my Lightroom screen when I bring it up? Because you were able to do that earlier.
Yeah. Did you close it out?
No, it's still open. I didn't close Lightroom at all.
Okay.
When you do
Maybe
share,
it's the virtual background.
oh, that wouldn't affect it.
No.
No.
Hey,
I think there's a share button, isn't there, Harry?
Harry, there's a share button. It says share screen, and there's a separate share button that you have to hit after share screen comes up.
Right.
You have to pick which screen you want to share.
And then hit share. And then hit the
Okay,
button.
should I hit one participant can share at a time? Let me try that.
So do share screen, and then it pops up with something and says share, and it'll ask you which screen you want to share or what you
Yeah.
want to share.
Oh, okay. Let me try that then.
All the screens that should show up when you hit share.
So when I hit share screen, what I see is one participant can share at a time, multiple participants can share simultaneously, advanced sharing options.
No, that's for a host. You don't need that. You just need to click share screen. It's a green button at the bottom.
Ah, I got it. Okay, we're good.
Yeah, there are two share buttons.
So can everybody see my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
On the share screen, there are two arrows. You want to go with the green arrow.
I did. And so now what came up on my screen was desktop, whiteboard, iPhone.
Right.
Click on
So
whatever you want to open
click on one of those and then say share. There you go.
There you go.
Okay, good. All right. So sorry about that.
Well,
And
that's
let me
No
first say that I don't normally wear a hat in the house, but I'm sitting underneath track lighting. So the bald guys in the room will understand that when I do Zoom, I've learned in Zoom meetings now to wear a hat if you're sitting underneath track lighting. This is what the finished product looks like, what you see here. But we are going to, let's see, that's what I started out with. So let me first say too that a lot of what I learned in Lightroom, that my first instructors in Lightroom were, let's see, I gotta get you guys out of the way here, were Roger Miller and Jeffrey Walk. So a lot of what I learned originally was from those guys. So let me try to get something out of the way here so I can see what I'm doing. So, you know, I have my workflow has actually changed a little bit from what I used to do. I used to start out at the top with the, you know, exposure to shadows. And that was actually how I originally did this image. But a couple weeks ago, the Maryland Photographers Alliance had a guest speaker, and she totally changed my workflow. So now I actually start out with the whites and the blacks, although typically the first thing I do is crop. And, you know, one of the things I remember Arthur Ranson said was that he can spend hours on a crop. I typically spend a few minutes on a crop, but I try to get down to what I feel like are the center points of, the focus. And, I'm also looking at rule of thirds and things like that because it's so easy to do on the grid. I may have straightened this a tad because I really like what I want to get in there was that now playing where this photograph was taken, as you can tell, during the pandemic, was about a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago. And it was, it's the Parkway Theater. So I had to take a picture of that for a client, a picture of the theater. And so I was taking different pictures of the theater, and then I noticed these two women sitting there. I thought they were kind of interesting. So I took a picture, I focused on them. And then the other thing I've been playing around with lately is, different, how you can change things. And this all came about too with some of the changes that, with the new Lightroom update, but I'm pretty sure I just took this to Adobe Standard because I knew at the very beginning I was going to take this to black and white. I was pretty sure that's what, to me, this picture spoke immediately as a street photograph that I was going to go black and white in. So I'm going to show you what I learned from this woman in this Maryland Photography Alliance thing. So what she does is she starts with or what she taught us to do is start with the whites. So you go all the way up there, and then you start to just kind of bring them back down till you get it kind of where you like it. And then you do sort of an opposite thing with the blacks and kind of do that. So rather than doing a global adjustment using exposure and contrast and the highlights, and I typically still go down. I like to go down on the highlights. And that was something I learned from Jeffrey too, or just something that Jeffrey got me in the habit of. And then what the other thing is, the whole process with this woman was, go all the way up with the clarity, then just gradually start to bring the slider down to where you like it. And, street photographs to me should always have a certain amount of grittiness to them. I think that's kind of the nature of street photography. It's urban, should be gritty. So I tend to do a global clarity a lot. And then, I kind of will do the same thing. I'll take it dehaze all the way up and then gradually start to bring it back down. And then typically I'm looking to at least get the blacks back up a little bit. Now, the other crazy thing this woman does is she takes you all the way up. You look at the vibrance and you look at the saturation and you decide which one does the least harm. And I'm saying I'm doing all this, even though I know I'm going to go to color. I'm going to do something a little bit different than what Lewis did, which is that I don't, and I'm not going to play with any of the saturation here. I don't convert in Lightroom. So I always convert black and white images in Photoshop. I shouldn't say always. It's something after taking some courses with Leo LeBeau, that was kind of his influence on me. And especially because, we've had Leo as a guest speaker and as a judge. And Leo is always talking about how he's always talking about the S-curve. So let's see. So what I'm going to do next is take this into Photoshop. And let's see. Hopefully this won't be slow. Why are you doing this to me? All right, actually you can see that I had some old images there already. So then I go, quickly to the adjustments, go down to black and white. I'll convert it in the black and white. Actually, what I didn't do this time, I typically always make a copy as soon as I get into, let's just undo that. So yeah, I always make a duplicate layer. So if I screw something up totally, then I'm okay. And I can then I'll do the conversion into the black and white. And I typically, and I am not, Lewis said there's about 16 different things that you can do in Lightroom. And, my experiences are about 116 or several hundred different things you can do in Photoshop. And it's like, it's all a matter of how you, I'm not a very experienced Photoshop user, but I do like, what I learned in terms of, going for that S curve. I'm not getting quite what I want here. Whoa, I had it. Yeah, that's what I want, sort of there. So the only thing is I've kind of blown out this area here, but I'm going to still leave that. And I'm going to copy that layer. And then typically what I might do next is, wait a minute, I'm trying to get to, yeah. I'm just going to maybe play with the contrast, bring up the brightness a little bit, because I felt like I blew so much out there. And then just for the sake of time now, I'm going to save this and go back to Lightroom. Okay, so now we have, this is the image now. And what I would also start doing with this, I'm going to do a little more, is I'll take a brush. I know I want to play with the clarity. So I'm going to, because I want to get more grit in their faces, although it's a little, I might bring this up a tad. And what I didn't do earlier, and I'm going to do it now. Actually, I'm going to do this a different way. I'm going to go to, I don't want that dark. So I'm going to, use the radial here and just bring this in just a tad. And then I might, oh, I'm not going to do that. Let's see, I'm going to go back. I want to bring clarity in again and play with that there. Now, I think this is what I did further with this, which is that I took this into, I don't know how many people are familiar with Luminar, but I took it in there. Should open up any second. Anybody have any questions while I'm waiting for this to open up?
Yeah. Hey, Harry, this is Kenny. I was wondering, like, you had the bottle behind her while you was in Photoshop. Are you going to leave that there, or would you have taken that out?
No, I'm going to leave it there because it's, it's a street photo. I think the bottle in some ways kind of adds something to it. So, I mean, that's just in my opinion. So other people might want to take it out because they find it a distraction. To me, it's all, and to me, I'm not saying I'm a photojournalist, but to me, it's sort of adds something to sort of, like I said, I like street photos to be gritty. So there's a number of, you can see there's a number of different, I definitely took this too far in one of the directions I went earlier because the detail in the wall wasn't as blown out in the finished product I showed you earlier. So usually what I might do is pick one of these out. And let's just say for the sake of, let's see, I'll do classic black and white. It looks like it's bringing a little detail back into the wall, which I definitely blew out. And then typically what I'll do is then you can take a brush and I want to make this, let's see, I want to make the brush just a tad smaller. That down, opacity down. And then I just might brush over anything I want to do here. So if I wanted to, you know, play with a red or something like that, but this is actually where I want to go. So I want to go to the detail, get the brush, and then I'm going to go over these people again, kind of go back over this wall, a little bit of the steps there. And I want to just add more detail. Then I might even sharpen this. Yeah, and just I'd say for the sake of time, I am gonna just, and one of the things you can do in this program too is, I don't know if I can get it below this, let me see if I can move it. I can't see the, anyway, there's a before and after you can use. It's being hidden by the Zoom controls. But so I'll just click done. And then
Harry, this is Mike. This is Mike. It looks like the wall in between the folks. I mean, you did a nice job on the right side of the photo. It looks like the wall in between the two people is still a bit blown out.
Oh, you mean, oh yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, it's
not that you need to change it now, but I was just wondering if you were seeing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at the original one that I talked about earlier, you know, the one that, so here's 3. So let's see. One of these might have, let's see. I think that's the one I originally did. So you can see that. That's
the one.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more detail there. So, you know, live TV, I kind of screwed up somewhere in the process of showing you my workflow. But, you know, when I was doing one of those things, you can see I really blew out the detail. But that was how I did it originally. But the flow that I followed was pretty much what I just showed you. And then, you know, I'll let Sandy ask, I mean, because in the interest of time, I had 2 other images, but I know it's just about 9:30 now. So I don't know if, you know, you want to try to move towards wrapping this up or not, or see if other people have questions. Sandy?
Oh, I'm sorry.
So what I was saying is, because I had 2 other images, but I also know it's 9:30, so I don't know what you want to do.
Are there any questions? Let's just see if anybody has questions.
Harry, this Mike again. The lady on the right, I'd have to go talk to her and get a session just with her. There is so much character in that face. It's just amazing.
I thought she was absolutely terrific, you know.
Well, what I see is the 2 generations.
Yeah.
The young one, you know, with the phone, how she's sitting, and then the older woman with the cane and her walker, and you know, it's precious.
Yeah, and you don't know whether they're mother or daughter or co-workers or friends, but you know there's probably a story there.
But you know what stands out to me with the woman on the right, her hand. Look at the nails she's really got her hands, you know, her nails done. It's just.
Yeah. What I didn't notice until you said the hand till just now was that band on her wrist. Like, it almost looks like the hospital ID brand.
Yeah, I'm looking at that too.
I actually did not notice that until tonight. And Kenny, if you look at this one, you know, the bottle's a little bit less blown out than the one that I worked with, but I kind of like that bottle there, just like I sort of still like the trash. I could have, you know, actually maybe coming closer on the crop and taking out that trash bag. I probably should have, but I kind of like it there too. You know, what I noticed the most too, though, was just how they were, you know, framed and centered under that now playing.
Yeah, the reason why I was asking that question, Harry, because even when I do street photography, I still try to, my focus is where do I want to draw the eye of the viewer? And so if my eye keeps wandering around looking at stuff there, it takes me off of the focus of those two people.
Right.
And that's, and I think that's the process I was talking about with Kaye, you know, before you even start an image, okay, what is it that you're trying to portray to the viewer? Where do you want the focus to be drawn at? See, I like how you crop where it says now playing. I would have kept that there. I think that really tells a story also. But some of the other stuff for me, it's just my personal opinion.
Right. Well,
I try to move those distractions out of the way to make you focus to them.
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things that both Lewis and Kaye said about black and white, I absolutely agree with. And you know, it's funny, Kaye said this, and I was about to say it. I would have said it if she hadn't, which, you know, used to be when I went to black and white was because the color was so bad. But then you start working with black and white, and there's certain things that just absolutely jump out to you when it's a street photograph. And you know, it's the kind of thing where it's going to look better in black and white.
Well, we also use black and white when we screw up in when we're doing a wedding.
Right.
The bride likes the picture, but it's just we know it's screwed up.
Yeah, you blew out the wedding.
Black and white.
Right.
Well, I think that now that it is 9:30, Harry, I don't think we need to go on to another image.
Can I just quickly show the finished other two? I'm not
yeah, perfect, perfect.
So, because they were both pandemic, yeah. So that was another finished one. Also, as you can see by the mask, pandemic. And so the other one was taken at Parkway Theater. There's a children's park in Mount Vernon. And I think typically they've been keeping it locked, but for the same client, they opened it up for me, and because they wanted me to get pictures of the children's park. And these two women came in there and sat down, and I didn't ask their permission. I just went away, shot. And so I was like, that was interesting because then later I asked them if I could take their picture, and they were like, no. And then let's see, that's where I started out with that one. And then
well, Harry, I just want to say the woman with her head down and her hand out, I mean, that is such a sign of the stress of the time.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the chow, I mean, oh my God, it's, well.
And then this is one that I actually took, this is way before, this was actually taken back in November in Astoria, in New York. And the guy was playing on the street, and he was great. And, you know, I put some money in his box, and he acknowledged me. But then this is how I took it to black and white. So you can see I went with a much closer crop and, you know, work more, you know, to bring out a lot of the detail in that one too. So that's it. I'll bring the screen back to you.
Very nice,
Harry, follow-up question regarding your interest in Luminar. What features do you actually use for your black and white, or what is the fundamental purpose of Luminar in your black and white workflow?
It's almost like using Nik. I don't have Nik anymore. You know, sort of the Nik. Are you familiar with Nik?
Yes.
So it has a lot of the same kinds of things that Solar Effects Nik has. And I want to get it again. But so the Luminar gives you some of the, you know, things to play with that does as far as different looks, and then being able to work. What I do like about it is you can go, you know, work with the brushes to go into, you know, maybe a specific part of the photograph. And because I use Luminar a lot for color photos too. And I just got another program, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's like, I think it's on one, where you can do the same thing. And, you know, it's a lot of things that people who are very experienced in Photoshop can easily do. I always consider Luminar and this other program, and I somewhat feel that way about Topaz, that, you know, like they're Photoshop for dummies. So I can do a lot of things that very experienced Photoshop users can do, but I can do them in those programs.
Which model Luminar do you use?
I think that's 4. It's the most recent Luminar.
Because I use Luminar a lot. Now I'm use mine mostly for portrait work and also sky replacements.
Yeah.
And because it's AI driven, it's going to be a little bit more precise, and it's going to really clean up your photos a lot better. So even if you have people in a landscaping, it's smart enough to know that there's people there, and if you're trying to do an HDR, it will avoid them. So that's the kind of technology that Luminar 4 has.
Right.
I don't know if anybody can see the background to my.
Yes.
Okay, that sky that's there,
Yeah.
I replaced that with Luminar in 5 minutes.
I was going to ask you if that wasn't.
That was all done in Luminar.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. It'll be in for
The birds?
it'll be in for competition soon.
Good, we'll see it.
Is that your guy though?
Say it again.
Is that a guy you took?
No, it had a different sky in there, and with Luminar has skies already in their program. It knows the color of the scene, or if it's a cool scene or a warm scene, and if you put like a warm sky there, it will warm up your photos down below. It matches, the AI technology will match it.
Yeah, Topaz has that now too.
Yeah.
I think Luminar is better though. So like I said, I use it mostly for the portrait side of it, because the portrait part of it for retouching skin is pretty good.
Yeah. So just another point about Photoshop. Kenny and I were both attending a Zoom session last night that the Maryland chapter of Professional Photographers of America put on, and it was on frequency separation, which I had no idea what that meant. But it's a Photoshop technique for cleaning up portraits, like if somebody has blotchy skin or acne and things like that. And maybe some of the more experienced people know what frequency separation was, but it was all new. And I guess you can use it for landscapes too.
I didn't know about the landscape, but I do use frequency separation, and Luminar is somewhat of a frequency separation. You have Portrait Pro, in Magic Moments, they all have frequency separation built in with plugins. So that's kind of, you know, we do it in Photoshop, that's kind of the long way to do it, but you have more control. So.
This is Jim Eichelman. I have a general question. Does anybody use the software that came with their cameras to actually do processing of the raw file before they go anywhere else? I was on something recently, and the person doing the presentation said that they started with the software from their camera, because it obviously has all of the
color profiles.
Well, yeah, all the profiles and all the algorithms and whatnot, and it may do a better job. I've never done it. Just curious if anybody does that.
Just as you can do that with any camera in Lightroom, with a color checker. If you take a picture of the color checker, there's a way that you can embed that information into Lightroom, so that when you're bringing your images in, it will color calibrate to your specific camera. It'll do it for any camera.
No, I'm just talking about the actual software there that came with the camera.
Jim?
But that's what I'm saying. You don't necessarily have to. You don't necessarily have to use your camera software. If you use a color checker, you can do it right in Lightroom, and it'll do the same thing.
Jim? Yeah, this is Kaye. I mean, I've tried it where I take my camera and you can, I think what you're saying, you can adjust exposure, saturation, change the profile. You can do all of that like in the camera, and then it saves another copy. I think it might save a JPEG in mine, but I never really liked it because you're just looking at the back of the screen, you know, the back of the camera. It's like you're working.
I'm talking about the software that you load on the computer, Kaye.
Hey, Jim,
Nikon.
some cameras, like for instance, Nikon comes with came with a CD that had their own software that you could use their work, and it was really good software. It was a really neat program.
Yeah, that's what I'm
I
talking
know
about.
that some others have it too, so that's I think what you're talking about. But
Capture
yeah, a lot of
NX.
the cameras do have their own software that you can use, but never do it from the camera because it only comes out, like Kaye said, a JPEG. But yes, there's a lot of, I don't know how many companies do it now, but I know Nikon did it, Olympus did it, because my cameras have it. It comes with a CD, if anybody remembers what they are. And you load the CD and it has their software. And the software for Nikon was really cool. And somebody else bought it and was using it. It had the sliders for each section.
Capture NX.
It was really, what?
It was called Capture NX.
Yes, yes.
But it's not supported anymore.
It was excellent, but it was an excellent program, but some others, but I think people have just gotten away from that because of Photoshop and Lightroom and all that. But that's what I think you meant, right?
It is, yes, exactly.
Okay.
Thanks.
But you know, the thing about it, Jim, is that even with those camera softwares, it's only going to take you but so far.
Yep.
You're still going to need to get in Lightroom. You're still going to need to go into Photoshop, because Lightroom and Photoshop will just expand your work far more than the camera maker's work can do.
At one time, a few years ago, Capture NX had some special sauce, and a lot of these raw files are being reverse engineered. But companies like Nikon and all of the others, they can't keep up with that software. So Adobe and Capture One and all that, I mean, they're kind of the way to go right now. But I think at one time, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think some of those programs were superior.
Yeah, and that's what I was talking about. Just the initial processing of the raw file. Just it has the algorithms of your camera.
Yep. I think that was true at one time.
Do any of you guys use Camera Raw versus Lightroom instead of just using Lightroom?
I use both. You can use.
Why would you choose one over the other?
You can use Camera Raw as a filter in Photoshop now, which is really awesome.
And why would you use one over the other?
I think Camera Raw gives you a couple of things. Now, I think Lightroom is Camera Raw on steroids.
Yeah.
So it's very similar. But if you're in Photoshop, you can actually use Camera Raw as a filter, and it does a lot of stuff. It does a few more things than Photoshop does. I think it does it better. It does black and white better, actually. But Lightroom is Camera Raw on steroids. I think it's very similar, but a lot more to it.
Yeah, you can do more in Lightroom.
Yeah, Lightroom.
Do you use Camera Raw and go into Photoshop using Smart Objects? Is that part of a typical workflow as well?
Yeah, Smart Objects are like the way to go if you're not using Lightroom. But Smart Objects give you the opportunity, first of all, you can enlarge things, make them smaller, you can change the size, and it rarely makes any mistakes or makes, pixelates or anything. But the other thing is, if you make a smart object, any changes you make to it, any filters you add, or anything you add, it actually just falls underneath, and you can go back and change those things all the time. So it's not destructive. So smart filters, if you do use them, and I do, it's a way to go. That's in Photoshop. In Lightroom, you don't need it because Lightroom's not destructive.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Mike Navargan. There's a question I have. I was always under the impression that Camera Raw had more information in it than if you had your image into another file. So once you put it into a PSD or into Lightroom, you wouldn't necessarily have as much information. If you have a blown out area or something, the Camera Raw would actually have more. Is that not true? Do you have the same amount of information once you switch over?
If you're working with a RAW file, you have all the information you can possibly use. If you're working with the JPEG, you don't. So that's the only difference.
Right. In Lightroom, you can work on RAW files in Lightroom.
And you should work with RAW files.
Yeah, so what I'm saying, whether you take it into Camera Raw or stay in Lightroom, the same information is still there.
Yep.
As long as you work, because even when I do raw files, I'll pull my raw files into Lightroom and I do all of my modifications there.
What about Photoshop though?
You can do it in Photoshop too. But what Steve was saying is that Lightroom is more of a beast.
Adobe
a lot to do in there.
Adobe Camera Raw is just Adobe's conversion software that's used in Photoshop and in Lightroom. So it's already built into Lightroom, which is its conversion. It converts your raw file into usable, images or usable processes. But what I'm saying is, if you're in Photoshop, you can actually use Camera Raw as a filter. Normally, if you open a raw file in Photoshop, it'll automatically open up Camera Raw.
Absolutely.
As a default. You can also tell it to open JPEG files in Camera Raw, and it gives you a lot of information. But I think what I'm saying, and what Kenny's saying too, is Lightroom's already got Camera Raw built into it. It's Camera Raw on steroids. But if you are using Photoshop, and I do use Photoshop a lot, I can use Camera Raw as a filter, which is, you go up into filter, and then there's Camera Raw right there, and you can actually use that as a filter, which can be really convenient, because there's some things I think you can do in Camera Raw that are better than what you can do in Photoshop, not Lightroom, but in Photoshop.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, you guys. So, you know what? Thank you so much, Lewis. I don't see you on my screen.
There he is. He's there.
Right over your head.
Good. And Kaye, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Harry, really, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, all three of you.
Thank you, guys.
What I'm gonna ask, if you could just quickly send me an email. What did you think? Did this work? Did it not? How would I improve it? How could we use these what I'm calling instruction nights? So please share. Good and bad, what worked, what didn't, okay? So,
Great.
Thanks, Sandy, for hosting.
Yes,
Sandy.
well, thank you, Lewis, for moderating and helping me set this up.
No.
So I would love to do it again, and I've got some other ideas, but anyway.
That was great.
Good, now I see you, Lewis, okay, good. I thought so, I learned a lot.
Lewis is right there.
Yeah, and I'm just hopeful that, newer members are gaining something from it and experienced as well. But I also like drawing on the experience of those who want to share their work and expertise, and I'll be calling on you. We have Steve Dembo coming up as a speaker.
Oh, no. Wait.
Oh, yeah, I figured it would be you, Jim.
I just burped, Steve, but you couldn't hear.
It's not, don't worry, guys. You got an entire month.
It's all love.
A month and a half.
I'd
We
like to
didn't
see.
love you so much, we'd probably say nothing.
We love Steve.
Oh, no.
I hate you all. Not true, not true, not
I
true.
just said I love you, man.
I love you all.
Man.
I love everyone. I love everyone. There's no one well, no, it's not true. There is a person I do hate, but not.
Steve, I am so looking forward to your presentation.
What? There he is. There's the guy.
Can you remind me what it is again, please?
What is?
Your presentation on
I'm
here.
not telling.
Look at
Well, I
the
need
calendar.
to know when I need to know so that I.
No,
can put it
I
in my
don't want you to.
calendar, not
I don't
just
want you to
know.
show up. I want you to write it off. So
Well, that's what I mean. I
tell
want
you.
to put it in my calendar so I know not to show up.
It's August. It's August. Put in. Hey, listen. Just put in that you're going to you have to do your hair on August 20th.
August 20th. Okay.
Yeah, and you'll be doing your hair, so you can't participate.
Okay.
Hey, Arthur, I can send you a hat.
You and I both know that he hasn't the slightest freaking idea yet what he's talking about.
Oh, no, I do.
Oh,
And
he
as a matter of fact,
Exactly.
Sandy, I just sent you a very long text, long email to answer your questions.
Okay, good. No, he's
It's going to be mostly
everything I need. After some prompting, right, Steve? Yeah.
Well, see if it's right. See if it's what you want.
Okay, good. Okay.
But I'm ready.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
I'm not even gonna cut my hair until August 20th.
All right.
I have it, Jim. I have hair, Jim.
By
Jim,
then
I have
you can
hair.
put on, by then you can put it in a bun.
Be careful, Jim. I have hair.
By then you can put it in a bun.
Almost there.
Silly.
The women love it.
I'm
Okay.
Oh, I hate being. God, I hate being an introvert.
I think a lot of us are getting sleepy now.
Yeah, I gotta
Oh,
go.
no. I think we're going to call it an evening now. You
Good
guys.
night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
I'm going to end the meeting. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye. Good night.
Awesome. Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks, Sandy.
See you next week.
you, Paula.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sandy.
Yeah, thank you.